Guys, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do this morning is I thought I would read you the story of Max Goes to Mars, and then we can talk about some of the science ideas in it as we go along. I think that a lot of you are familiar with the first book, Max Goes to the Moon, where he helps us get started with a colony on the moon. And so in this story, we're going to see what happens next. Some of you may recognize in this painting on the cover that we can see Max in his spacesuit on Mars, and we can see right here, what is that? It's the Spirit rover on Mars, so it's one of the two rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. They're actually on Mars right now. They're robotic rovers. We've had lots of robotic spaceships on Mars, several rovers and landers, lots of spaceships orbiting Mars that are robot spaceships, nobody on them. But no human being has ever been to Mars. No person, no dog, no one has ever been.
I forgot what I was.
I think some of you may even remember the real Max. You can see here that even though he's never really been to Mars, he was a very real dog. And you can see here in this picture that he was a very large dog, but also pretty clearly a very friendly dog. This is a story of how Max the dog helped humanity take the next giant leap, far beyond the moon, to the wondrous planet Mars. It had been a few years since Max and his friend Tori helped start the moon colony. Thousands of people had already visited the moon, but no one had yet traveled beyond. Tori and Max stayed busy at home on Earth. Tori was in school and Max would play all day. They loved to go for evening walks, especially when the sky was clear and dark. Tori could always spot the planets among the stars. Sometimes when Mars was bright, she imagined that it was calling out to them, inviting a girl and her dog to visit. And there you might see Mars right up there, that red dot. That's kind of the way it looks in the night sky when we can see it. Right now you can't really see it, but a couple months ago, maybe some of you noticed it in the sky. It was pretty bright for a while earlier this year. Tori got the phone call when Max was out doing his famous merry-go-round trick. As a puppy, he'd learned to spin the merry-go-round on his own, jumping on and off, and sometimes just riding around. He still loved the trick, and kids usually came to ride with him. "It's Commander Grant," said Tori. "They want a dog to go along on the first trip to Mars." Max just kept on playing. And by the way, all the things that Max does in the story, even though in real life, obviously, he never went to Mars, all the kinds of games he does in the story are all things that he really did. He really did a trick like this with the merry-go-round. Back on our website, you can see a video of it. Tori was both happy and sad. Happy that Max would get to go along on such a great adventure. Sad because she knew that this time he'd have to go without her. Tori remembered visiting a scale model of the solar system in Washington, D.C. She learned that even when it's closest to Earth, Mars is about 150 times as far away as the moon. The trip to Mars would take too long for a girl still in school. And so in this painting, you see this scale model of the solar system. And in this scale model, we have one actually here in Boulder on the CU campus, so maybe you've been over there by the Fisk Planetarium and seen it. And in that model, we've taken the real solar system. You know how a scale model works, right? We make things smaller by a certain amount. And in this case, we make everything from the real solar system 10 billion times smaller than it really is. And that makes the sun about this big. Now you may think, okay, if the sun's this big, how big is Earth? Maybe some of you can show me with your hands or fingers, how big do you think Earth is if this is the sun? Good, I see some good guesses. In fact, if this is the sun, Earth is smaller than the ballpoint in one of your ballpoint pens. Earth is really, really teeny tiny compared to the sun. And it's also kind of far from the sun. In this scale, it's about a little more than 15 yards away. So if you imagine I take the sun here, it's good that I have an imaginary one because it's easier to watch it. Ready? I'm going to throw it back into that corner. You see it floating over the desk back there now? Good. Good. So that's where the sun is. Here's Earth on that scale, this tiny little ballpoint. What does Earth do every year? Orbits around the sun. So that's what space kind of looks like. Now you might be thinking, okay, where's the moon? Turns out the moon is even smaller than Earth. And if you imagine that I've got Earth on my thumb, the moon is only this far away from Earth. And what does the moon do? It goes around the Earth. One say, move. Right, one's a move. Once a move, remember that. Some people call it a month, but it's really a move. That's how it gets its name. And together, they go around the sun once a year. Once a year for Earth to go around the sun. Now you may be thinking, okay, where's Mars? Well, on this scale, Mars, even when sun's over there, Earth and moon are here, even when it's closest, Mars is still past that corner of the room. It's another few yards that way. So you can see it's a lot farther to go to Mars than it is to go to the moon.
Yeah.
That means it's going to take a while. It's going to take a few months. In this story, it's going to take 4 months to get to Mars. In real life, most of our spaceships take longer than that, but we can do it in principle. So take a few months to get to Mars. So you imagine Earth's here, and you take off, and you go to Mars. It takes you a few months to get there. And you say, great, now let's go home. But there's a problem. What's Earth doing during those few months? Moving around the sun. Let's imagine, let's say 6 months to make it easier. Let's say it took 6 months. In 6 months, if we start out with Earth right here, where's Earth 6 months from now? Way over on the other side of the sun, right? Mars also orbits the sun, but it takes longer. It takes about 2 years to go around the sun. So in 6 months, Mars will have moved only about a quarter of the way around the sun. So it's way over there somewhere, which means by the time you get to Mars, Earth is way over there, Mars is way over there, and it's too far to come home.
You gotta wait until they're
You've got to wait until they're together again. When will they be together again? Well, let's think about it. Imagine we start with them together like this, right? Mars out there, Earth here. After 1 year, where will Earth be? Right here again, right? Same place, and we've gone around the sun once. Where will Mars be after 1 year?
over here.
All the way on the other side of the sun, since it takes about 2 years to go around. After the second year, where will Earth be? Here again, right? Every year it gets back to the same place. After the second year, where's Mars? Now it's back here again, which means you can come home after 2 years. So if you want to go to Mars, you're going to be gone for 2 years. And that's why it's too far for a girl still in school. Tori thought Max should know a little about his destination. Listen carefully, Max. We call Mars the red planet because it looks like a reddish dot in the night sky. Long ago, people of many cultures gave Mars different names and made up stories about it. The name Mars comes from the ancient Roman god of war. Max stood very still, staring right past Tori. Good. I can see that you're listening, she said. Is he really listening to her? No, what's he doing? He's looking up at the squirrel up there. Right? And by the way, I know we have some fans of the Percy Jackson books here. Who's Mars? Ares, right? Ares is the Greek name for Mars, is the Roman name for it. Well, Max, it gets even more interesting, she continued. 100 years ago, a few scientists thought there were great cities on Mars. Some people even worried about Martians invading Earth. Can you imagine that? Tori laughed. Max was definitely imagining something. And you might notice in this painting, Tori is imagining the famous science fiction story, The War of the Worlds. And Max is imagining playing frisbee tug-of-war with a fire-breathing squirrel. Tori took Max to a science museum where they walked through an exhibit of Mars. We know a lot about Mars now, she explained, because many nations have sent spacecraft to Mars, but none of these spacecraft have carried any people or animals. That's why your trip is going to be so exciting. Tori suddenly became more serious. Max, there aren't any cities or Martians on Mars, but you could still help us make one of the most important discoveries in human history. By the way, some of you might recognize this science museum.
Yeah.
What's that? That's the Space Odyssey exhibit at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Mars is a cold, dry planet today, continued Tori, but scientists think that Mars had lakes and rivers a long, long time ago. There might still be water underground, and if there's water, well, maybe there's life. Martian life would probably be too small to see without a microscope. Still, if you found even the tiniest living creature on Mars, we'd finally know for sure that we're not alone in the universe. Max sniffed excitedly at the floor, proving that he was well equipped for the search for microscopic life. Excuse me. You might notice in this picture that there are some rules painted on the wall. No dogs, no food, no drinks. Oops. You might also see that there's a picture from Mars taken by, this is a painting of a picture, a real picture taken by the Spirit rover, and you can see what Mars really looks like. And it is a very cold, dry place today. There's no liquid water on Mars anywhere on the surface. Anyway, in fact, you can't even have liquid water on Mars. If you went to Mars in a spaceship and you poured a cup of water inside the spaceship and then you put on your spacesuit and you went outside with a cup of water, that water would all either immediately freeze or evaporate. In fact, if you took an ice cube outside and you heated it with a torch, it wouldn't melt, it would convert straight into water vapor, go straight from being frozen to gas without being a liquid in between. And you know, there's something on Earth that you might have seen that does the same thing. Right now? Dry ice, right. Dry ice does that. It doesn't melt into a liquid, it becomes gas right away. That's why they like to use it to make smoke, right? Because it's cold smoke. What is dry ice? Anybody know? Yes and that? Yes. Carbon dioxide, right. Dry ice is frozen carbon dioxide. On Mars, water does the same thing that frozen carbon dioxide does here on Earth. And yet, when we take pictures, and I know it's hard to see from where you are, but this is a picture taken from one of the spaceships that looks down on Mars from orbit. And you see all these branches that are coming together, and if you think about what that might be, and you imagine what you've looked at out of airplane windows and so on, you'll realize that what this looks like is it looks like a bunch of little creeks and streams flowing together into a giant river. And that's exactly what it is. It's a dried up riverbed on Mars. So that tells us that even though there's no liquid water on Mars today, there used to be liquid water there a long time ago. There had to have been to make all those rivers. So sometime in the past, there was water on Mars, and that's why we're so interested in going there and looking to see if maybe, as a result, there was life. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Thank you. As launch day approached, Tori and Max left Earth and returned to the moon colony where the Mars ship was waiting. So you see in this painting, if you look out the window, you know they're on the moon. So they're going to go from the moon to Mars. Tori could not hide her tears as she gave Max a big goodbye hug. She knew that Mars lines up with Earth in its orbit only about every 2 years, just like we talked about before. Max and the crew would have to stay on Mars almost that long before they could return home. Commander Grant saw the concern on Tori's face. "Don't you worry," he said. "We tested everything over and over again. It will be a long trip, but we'll all be fine." The Mars ship quickly left the moon and Earth far behind. Max and the astronauts were traveling far faster than anyone in history, but the trip would still take more than 4 months. It was disorienting to be so far from any place, and they had no sense of up or down as they floated weightlessly in the ship. The astronauts didn't have much to do on the long trip, which is one of the reasons they brought Max along. His weightless antics provided endless entertainment, and he was very helpful when someone felt homesick. There's nothing quite as comforting as petting a dog or getting an upside-down weightless kiss. Back on Earth, Tori had a special privilege. Each day before school, she received a private video phone call from the crew. During a call one day about halfway through the voyage to Mars, Commander Grant pointed his camera out the window to show Tori the tiny Earth and moon in the distance. "That's where you are," he said. Not just me, she thought. Every person who has ever lived grew up on that tiny blue dot. And I know it's very hard to see, but there's Earth and the moon in the video screen, the two little dots. And you can think about it. Remember what we talked about? Here's on our scale model, Earth and the moon are smaller than the ballpoints in your pen and about this far apart. Mars is way off that way. So imagine that you're halfway or more to Mars and you look back. What's Earth and the moon going to look like? Two little tiny dots. And it's pretty amazing to think that there's Earth, and now I've covered it up with my finger, the entire world where everyone who has ever lived has been. The astronauts were very happy When Mars finally began to loom large ahead of them, they had all spent time on the moon, but this was different. Mars is much bigger than the moon, though still much smaller than Earth. It even has 2 moons of its own, named Phobos and Deimos. But they are so small that they look more like rocks than worlds. And in this painting, you see Mars and the spaceship coming by. There's Phobos. Deimos is off in the distance, but it's hard to see here. And this picture right here shows you how big Mars is compared to Earth. So you can see Mars is a lot smaller than Earth, but it's bigger than the moon. The descent to Mars was scary but fun. For a few long minutes, the ship blazed through the thin Martian atmosphere. Then the crew opened the ship's parachutes to slow down. Finally, they used small rockets to zero in on the landing site. The equipment for their base camp was already there because it had been sent to Mars 2 years earlier. And you might think about that. Remember, you're going to be on Mars for 2 years, right? That means you're going to need a lot of stuff. You have to have a lot of food. You can get water from the ice on Mars. There's plenty of ice. You can develop that for your water. You're going to need a lot of supplies for 2 years. Well, that means you probably can't fit them all on your spaceship. So you're probably going to have to send an extra spaceship with all your supplies. Now imagine that you send that spaceship at the same time as you. What if something went wrong and that spaceship crashed or landed in the wrong place? Well, you'd be in big trouble, right? Because you'd be at Mars, you're stuck there for 2 years, but you wouldn't have your supplies. So what's the safer thing to do? Send those supplies to Mars when Mars and Earth are together, and then wait 2 more years until they're together again before you go. That way you know that your supplies already arrive safely before you go. After 4 months in a small spaceship, Max and the astronauts were eager to get outside. It looked almost Earth-like, but they knew they'd have to wear spacesuits to survive. The crew spent a few weeks recovering from the effects of weightlessness and preparing their base camp. They tended to the plants in the greenhouses. They checked the air and water recycling systems. Most important, they set up a factory to make the rocket fuel they would need to leave Mars. As usual, Max entertained everyone. He loved playing with the weak gravity of Mars, where he could jump 3 times as high as he could on Earth, but only half as high as he could on the moon. And you know, just because it's a long time to sit still, let's do some Mars jumps. Let me have everybody stand up very, very quietly. On the count of 3, we'll start with Earth jumps. On the count of 3, I want you to jump as high as you can. 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Now I want you to do a Mars jump, which means I need you to jump 3 times as high as you just did. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Good try, but that was the same as the last one. Let's see. I want you 3 times as high. 1, 2, 3. That still looked the same to me. 3 times as high. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you can sit down. Of course, I asked you to do something impossible, right? It's impossible to jump 3 times as high as you can on Earth if you're still on Earth.
What about inside the
But if you were on Mars, you'd be able to jump 3 times as high. Most of you, when you jump up, probably get your feet about 2 feet off the ground, which means on Mars, your feet would get 6 feet off the ground. And on the moon, they get twice as high as that, which is 12 feet, which means you would have crashed your head into the ceiling. Also, worth noting that if you had a basketball court on the moon, where the hoops are 10 feet high, you could all jump easily high enough not only to dunk the basketball, but to jump completely over the hoop. After a while, the astronauts began to take longer trips from base camp. They could travel for weeks in their pressurized rover. One of their first trips took them to an historical site, the robot rover named Spirit, which had landed on Mars way back in 2004. It was still right where it had stopped many years ago, but it was now coated with Martian dust. Max regarded it warily, as if it might start rolling again at any moment. And of course, this story takes place in the future when the rovers have stopped long ago, but in real life, in 2010, the 2 rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, are actually both still working. Opportunity is still driving around. Spirit is stuck right now in the sand. They can't get it to go because its wheels won't move. They're hoping that maybe they can get it going again, but we don't know. It could be that that's where Max will find it, right where it is now. At every stop, the crew collected rocks for scientific study. By figuring out what the rocks were made of and how long ago they formed, the astronauts learned about the history of Mars. Max had a special job. His spacesuit had an attachment that let him sniff at rocks or the outside air. He was trained to bark as he caught the scent of any sign of life. Commander Grant showed him rock after rock. Nothing. If there had ever been life here, Max wasn't finding it. So in this picture, you can see the idea, which is that you need to wear a spacesuit on Mars. You don't want to take your spacesuit off, so he's got this special attachment. That's very, very important because you all know that if you took your helmet off on Mars, you would die. You know, it'd be bad, but I don't want to talk about it any more than that. It's too. Sometimes I talk about this with older kids, but this is way too gruesome for fourth graders. So. Don't say I didn't warn you. All right. You sure you want to hear this? Yeah! You know, we have something here on Earth called air. And the air creates something that we call air pressure. Are you familiar with air pressure? Air pressure pushes on us in all directions. In fact, there's a lot of air pressure on Earth. If you could actually weigh the air pushing down on just 1 square inch of your shoulders, it would weigh 15 pounds. So we say that the air pressure on Earth is 15 pounds per square inch. That's a lot of weight on your shoulders. And yet you don't notice it, do you? Why don't you notice it? Well, there's 2 reasons why you don't notice that air pressure, all that weight on your shoulders. One reason is because air pressure is not only pushing down, it pushes in all directions. So it also pushes sideways and up and everything else. So that keeps it kind of balanced. But the even more important reason is that you have an Earth body. And Earth bodies are made for Earth, which means they have pressure inside them. Because otherwise, the outside pressure would squeeze us. But we, inside our bodies push back out with the same 15 pounds per square inch that the air pressure pushes in. And therefore, it all feels nice and balanced and comfortable. Now, Mars has air too, but not very much of it. It has so little that it's almost like being on the moon with no air at all. In fact, the air pressure on Mars is less than like 1 ounce per square inch. So it's pretty much like there's no air at all. That means if you went to Mars and you did not have a full spacesuit covering your entire body, what would happen? Well, you have an Earth body. What do Earth bodies do? They push out with 15 pounds per square inch. But on Mars, there's really nothing pushing back in to balance it. Which means, in essence, that your insides would want to get out. Your blood would start to boil inside you. You would begin to ooze from your eyelids and your nose and your mouth and your ears. Even your sweat pores would start to ooze blood out that would boil away. And in about 30 seconds, you would die a horrible, painful death. So, the important thing to remember is if you go to Mars or the moon or any place where there's no air, you must wear a complete full spacesuit to keep air all around you with that air pressure. If you got even a tiny cut in the glove of your spacesuit that let the air out, you would die that horrible, painful death. You must have a full spacesuit on. Now here's the issue. You see, Max, they want him to sniff the rocks. Obviously, they better not take his helmet off or he'll die. So what we have in the story this special attachment that lets the outside air come in so he can sniff it, but it doesn't let his inside air go out, so he stays okay. And what's he sniffing for? Life. And what's he supposed to do if he finds it? Good. As the months passed, Max and the crew saw many amazing places on Mars. They spent weeks exploring the rim of the Great Valles Marineris, a canyon that is almost as long as the United States is wide. The steep canyon walls dropped so far that it was difficult to see the bottom, and only in a few places could they see all the way across to the other side. In those places, the view was stunning, especially in the morning when low clouds formed in the Martian sky. Staring across the abyss, it was easy for the crew to imagine that they were back home on Earth, overlooking a giant version of the Grand Canyon. They were getting a little homesick, after all. How they wished they could just take off their spacesuits and breathe in fresh air. But when they saw the tiny blue Earth shining in the Martian dawn, they remembered that home was nearly 100 million miles away. Their last planned outing took them to Olympus Mons, an ancient volcano that is the biggest mountain in the solar system. Max led the way as they hiked up the steep slopes around its base. And by the way, all the places I tell you about in the story are real places. There's a picture of Olympus Mons from orbit, a giant volcano. They had time to explore only a little bit of the great mountain before it was time for the long drive back to base camp. That was when disaster almost struck. A huge Martian dust devil swept straight across the rover's path. Inside, it sounded like someone was sandblasting their car. They had to stop driving because they couldn't see anything out the windows. Luckily, the storm soon blew past, but they decided to alter their course to avoid other storms. And here you can see this big dust devil, and in fact, there really are big dust devils like this on Mars all the time. You've probably seen dust devils here on Earth. They look kind of like miniature tornadoes, but you know that tornadoes come down from the sky, dust devils go up from the ground, and on Earth, dust devils are usually pretty small. But on Mars, sometimes the dust devils get really big, like here in this story. Their new route gave them a chance to make one last stop. It was an ancient riverbed not far from another volcano. They parked the rover and got out to explore. And then Commander Grant nearly jumped out of his spacesuit when the sound of Max barking suddenly blasted into his earphones. He quickly turned and saw Max sniffing and digging at the bottom of the dry riverbed. Commander Grant grabbed the drill and ran over to Max. He drilled down and down, bringing up the rock from deep underground. It was wet. Max and the crew returned to base camp as quickly as they could. In the base camp lab, Commander Grant used his microscope to look into the tiny, watery holes within the rock. He could barely contain his excitement as he realized what he was seeing. "Max," he shouted, "you did it! You discovered life on Mars." Is there really life on Mars? Maybe. We don't know if there's life on Mars or not, but we know there used to be water on the surface. There could still be water underground, so maybe there is microscopic life on Mars. And how will we ever find it if there is? Said Max.
Come on, Max, let's go.
Max was a hero once again. On Earth, people planned celebrations to greet Max and the crew. On Mars, the crew prepared to leave. They made sure the base camp was properly closed so it would be ready for the next Mars explorers. Then they returned to their rocket and blasted off for home. It took 3 months to reach the moon, where doctors checked the crew for good health and scientists stored the samples for future study. Then Max and the crew returned home to Earth. Tori had missed Max so much. He'd been gone for more than 2 years, and she knew he was getting old for a dog. She was very proud of him, and she wanted to treasure all the time he had left in his dog's life. Max was glad to be back too. He traveled farther and seen more than any dog in history. But he knew one thing as he looked out at the trees and squirrels and blue sky. There's no place like home, and no planet like Earth. Tori seemed to know what he was thinking. "Someday I'll make a trip to Mars too," she said, "and maybe even to planets beyond Mars. But I don't think we'll ever find another world quite as wonderful as this one." And that is the end. And at the back of the book, you know that I always end my books with an activity, and there's an activity where you can learn about how Mars moves in our sky. And here's a real map of Mars that shows you some of the places they visit in the story. And I think before we go to questions, we have enough time for me to show you a few more pictures of the real Max, so you can get to know him a little better. How many of you have been to a wedding? How many of the girls have been a flower girl? Max was a flower dog. Some of you know Brooke. That's Max and Brooke when she was very little. And Max and Grant. And you could see Max was so big that both kids could fit on top of him at the same time. When Brooke was really little, she used to like to put dog biscuits in Max's mouth. But she was so little that she didn't know that after you put the dog biscuit in his mouth, you're supposed to let go of it. No, Max, this is to show you how gentle Max was. He was so gentle that you know what he would do? He would just use his tongue and slowly pull the biscuit out of her hand. She had so much fun feeding him that regular meal time, even though you're not supposed to bother a dog when it's eating. She didn't know that either. And luckily with Max, it didn't matter. If she saw him going to eat out of his bowl, she'd run over, take her little hand, and shove his head out of the bowl. He didn't get mad. He would just wait patiently until she reached in and let him eat out of her hands. Remember in the story, we see them at the Science Museum? He really did get to go back there. That's at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And if you go to that museum exhibit, you know the way it works is that you're walking around and there's this glass here, and behind the glass you're supposed to be, it's like you're in the Mars colony looking out the window to the outside. And since that on the other side of the glass is the outside, they don't let you go back there. They only let the people who work there go back there, and of course they have to wear their spacesuit costumes, since without a spacesuit you would die that horrible death that we talked about. Now when we brought Max there to the museum, turns out they didn't have a spacesuit that fit him. So they let him go back there without the spacesuit. And that's okay, because it was only a fake Mars. If it had been a real Mars, it couldn't do that. Remember, there's his famous merry-go-round trick. In the first book, it all starts out with him howling at the siren, and he really did howl at the sirens. You can see him there in howling position. And in this story, you remember he imagines playing frisbee tug-of-war with the fire-breathing squirrel? Frisbee tug-of-war, 2 against 1, and he's doing okay, isn't he? I believe that was during reindeer tryouts for Santa's sleigh. I don't think Santa was fooled by the costume. And that is the end. We have time for a few questions. Teachers, can I have you help me out here? Let's, one from each class, a question, and why don't you call on someone, and if you're called on, please stand up and speak loudly.
Riley, do you want to stand up?
I was wondering, where is your dog Max?
The real Max died a few years ago. We have a new Max, although we actually call him Cosmo. But if you look very closely at these covers, you'll notice Max, says Max too, but you'll notice this is a different dog. This is our new dog, who you will get to meet sometime. And in the story, you'll find out that this is the grandson of the original Max. Okay. How about some space or science questions or writing questions?
Georgia?
Has anyone ever died because of their spacesuits?
Has anyone ever died because of a problem with their spacesuit? No, luckily not. We make spacesuits pretty well, and they make them with lots of layers and different stuff, so no one's ever had that problem, although there have been times when they were worried. Like some of the astronauts, if you go down and see the Hubble IMAX movie, I think they even talk about that, how they had to be very careful because some of the tools they work with when they're fixing things out in space could make a cut in their spacesuit glove. So they have to be very, very careful to make sure they don't slice through the glove or something, because that would be bad if it did.
Mary Scott?
Am I going to make any more books? You know, I'm thinking about sending Max elsewhere. I haven't started on it yet, but hopefully so. Pluto's one of the possibilities, but you know, Pluto won't be for a while, because remember, what I'm trying to do in these stories is write stories that teach about things we really know, the real science. We don't know very much about Pluto right now, but we will know a lot about Pluto in about 5 years after the New Horizons spaceship gets there. So I have to wait a while for Pluto. Maybe Saturn. Good ideas. Okay, who's our next question?
Ben, do you want to ask?
How did you
Stand
guys?
up, please.
find out about what happens when you get cut?
You know, luckily no one's ever actually tested it to see what would happen if you had a problem with your spacesuit. But it's actually very easy to understand. You know, it's kind of like almost the reverse of what happens when divers go underwater. When divers go underwater, the deeper you go, the more problems you have because of the higher and higher pressure underwater, right? So divers who dive deep can get something called the bends, which can kill them because of the pressure getting too high. And so it's just the opposite. We understand these kinds of things because we understand how pressure works. So we don't actually have to test it to know that that's what would happen, luckily.
Sean?
Since there's not as much gravity as there is in Earth, could they jump off the cliff and not get hurt?
You know, so that's a very good question. With less gravity, you will fall more slowly than you would on Earth for the same amount of time. So if you jumped off of the same height, like if you jumped off the roof on Earth, that would be pretty bad. But on Mars, since the gravity is only a third as strong, you wouldn't be going that fast when you hit the ground, so you could probably jump off the roof without getting hurt. But if you jumped off a tall cliff, you have so far to fall that even though you would be falling slower than you would from the same cliff on Earth, by the time you got to the bottom, you'd be going pretty fast, so it would still be bad. Time for a couple more if you want to keep going.
What is beyond UFOs?
Oh, Beyond UFOs is about the real search for extraterrestrial life, so just like looking for life on Mars and life on other places. And that's one I wrote mostly for grown-ups. I think maybe when you get to middle school you might want to try it out. It might be a little bit hard right now.
Jack? Stand up.
Your lungs could explode if you don't do the proper thing while emerging in scuba diving. Yeah.
It's kind of like that same idea, right? Because what happens is that the nitrogen in your blood kind of gasifies and can cause big problems.
Sarah?
Oh, that's a very good question. Why did I choose to make Max the main character in the stories? Well, you know, you probably have figured out that the reason I wrote these books is because I think space and science are really cool, and I wanted to write books that would have kids also think space and science are really cool. So I had that idea for a long time, but I never had a really good idea of how to write a story like that. And actually one day I was out pushing Grant when he was very small on his stroller, and I had Max with me, and I looked up in the sky and I saw the moon, and I don't quite know why, but right at that moment it popped into my head, maybe I should tell a story about Max going to the moon. And I thought, well, you know, kids usually love dogs, right? And we love space too, so how about we put the two together, dogs and space. So that's where it came from.
Kendall?
Oh, very good question. How long did it take me to write the book? Well, you know, sitting down and writing the story the first time didn't take me that long, maybe a couple of days. The boxes on the sides of the page that I call the big kid boxes that explain all the science, maybe another couple of days. But of course you know that when I did that I wasn't done, was I? Because that was only the first draft. Right? You all know about second draft, right? So the second draft, a lot of times the second draft can take you even longer than the first draft, because the first draft you're just getting the ideas down, but the second draft you're thinking, I have an idea that's in my head, and I want the people reading it to see what's in my head. And so you read it very carefully and you say, are they seeing what's in my head now? And if your answer is maybe not quite, it means you got some work to do. And it can take a long time to get a better second draft. And then after you get that better second draft, that's good. And that way you're ready to do your third draft. And your fourth. And your fifth. And your sixth. And altogether, I would say on this book I did about 17 drafts before it was done. So the whole process took me about a year. So remember that. The first draft's the easy part. It's figuring out how to get it better in those other drafts that you really have to work on. And just always ask yourself, will the person reading it see the same thing that I'm seeing in my head? And if the answer's not yet, then keep working. Good.
I think
We need to go to special, so.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.